Good morning, everyone. I'm Avraham Sela, and I'll replace Professor Gad Barzilai, who could not make it this morning. And because the issues discussed this session are not exactly my field, I will content with some short questions and open the floor to questions and answers immediately after the presentations. The second thing is Professor Janice Stein also could not make it, but she sent us a recorded video of her presentation, and we will watch it. So given the fact that there is a lot to be screened on the wall, could you please move to the center as much as you can? I simply offer it because I think it would be more convenient to all of you to watch from the center rather than from the fringes. I'll start by, we have 3 speakers today, including Janice Stein, who is not present here. The first speaker would be Dr. Amichai Magen, who is a lecturer at the Lauder School of Government at the IDC Herzliya and head of political department at the International Institute for Counterterrorism, also in the IDC Herzliya. He's also a fellow at the Hoover Institution at Stanford University. Previously, he was director of the Institute for Democracy, Law, and Diplomacy at the Shalem Center, Jerusalem, 2009-2011, and lecturer in law at Stanford Law School between 2004 and 2005. He was a pre-doctoral fellow at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford University, and in 2008 he became the first Israeli to be awarded the prestigious National Fellow Award at the Hoover Institution, Stanford University. In 2002, he received the Yitzhak Rabin Fulbright Award. Amichai Magen holds a doctoral in juridical studies, doctorate in juridical science, and BA in law and political science from Cambridge. I'll go over his most important publications. Well, I'll say that he is an editor of the International Act of Democratization and the Rule of Law, published by Routledge 2009 with Leonardo Morlino, and Promoting Democracy and the Rule of Law, American and European Strategies with Thomas Riese and Michael McFall. His current research addresses international relations, legal and comparative aspects of political violence, security threats emanating from weak and failed states, processes of democratization, developing countries, and governance in areas of problematic sovereignty. Amichai will talk about theorizing external influence on legal and institutional development in Israel. The second speaker will be Janice Stein, and I don't think we need to present Janice with so many details. She's a well-known scholar of international relations. She's a Belzberg Professor of Conflict Management in the Department of Political Science and Director of the Munk School of Global Affairs at the University of Toronto. She's a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada and a member of the Order of Canada and the Order of Ontario. Her most recent publications include Networks of Knowledge, Innovation in International Learning of 2000, The Cult of Efficiency 2001, and Street Protests and Fantasy Parks 2001. She was a Massey Lecturer in 2001 and a Trudeau Fellow She was awarded the Molson Prize by the Canada Council for outstanding contribution by a social scientist to public debate, and she is honorary foreign member of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. There are many more awards and publications that I won't go through. Our last speaker will be Professor Robbie Sable, who is a former counselor for political affairs in Israel's embassy in Washington, the legal advisor to the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs, Foreign Ministry's Deputy Director General for Arms Control and Disarmament, and head of Israel delegation at the Taba arbitration with Egypt, and many other positions in the legal system and foreign relations of Israel. His publications include Procedure in International Conferences by Cambridge University Press, second edition, 2006, and International Law by the Faculty of Law, the Hebrew University of Jerusalem, 2010. Professor Janice Stein will speak on Inside Out, Israel at the as the exposed nerve of the international legal order, and Robbie Sable will speak about Israel and the UN resolutions. And without any further ado, I pass the floor to Dr. Amichai Magen.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Professor Sela. Boker Tov. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, just a quick apology. Having woken up twice over this past night to feed a 5-month-old baby, I feel a little bit like that famous English lord who was dreaming at night that he was giving a speech in the House of Lords and woke up to discover that he was in fact doing exactly that. So I hope you'll forgive me. I'll try to be as lucid as I possibly can. What I want to do today, and I think it's appropriate that my talk kind of in this panel, which I believe does have shared elements and themes that you'll see converging together a little bit like a puzzle. What I want to do is to sort of lay out some ideas about how do we think about external, right, international, transnational influence, impact on domestic, institutional, and legal change. This is a topic that international lawyers have started to touch on. This is a topic that Peter Gurevich wrote a very famous essay on in 1978, and it's impacted international political economy and several other branches of international relations theory. But when it comes to processes of democratization, of changes in the rule of law, of regulatory structures, and so on and so forth, the impact of that second image reverse, the Peter Gurevich work, has actually been very limited, and political scientists and lawyers are discovering it now, and we're trying to figure out how do we think about this issue of external influence on domestic change. What I'm going to do today is lay out some theory, some concepts, and I'm going to try to apply this theory to the relationship between the European Union and Israel, okay? I'm going to not be a very sophisticated lawyer. I'm going to give you my argument up front so you can have plenty of time to attack me in the question and answer session. I'm going to give you my argument up front, but I'm going to spend most of my time talking about the theory, right? Because the theory is wider than the case study. The theory, with this theory, I believe what we can also think about a project I'm currently working on, which is what I'm calling the OECDization of Israel, right? How the preparation of Israel to join the OECD, how is Israeli membership in the OECD transforming Israeli governance. But we can also think about the impact of China's membership in the WTO. We can also think about Chile joining the OECD, and so on and so forth. So I hope that the theory that I lay out will be of wider interest to you than the narrow EU-Israel case study. Okay, fair enough. So let me lay out the basic argument with regards to EU-Israel relations, and then I'll delve into the theory. What I set out to do in this paper was to, I believe for the very first time, really try to evaluate how successful has the European Union been in deploying instruments of conditionality and socialization and so on and so forth in trying to transform Israeli institutions and law? The EU has been trying to do this with its candidates for membership, but also in the Balkans, vis-à-vis Turkey, and now in the European neighborhood, right? The EU has been doing this for quite some time through the Barcelona process and later on the European neighborhood policy. How successful has it been? And what I find is that really there's little evidence that deliberate EU influence mechanisms, right, conditionality, attempts at socialization, persuasion, capacity building, have resulted in significant institutional change in Israel. However, that doesn't mean that there is no impact at all. I do find that Israelis emerge as very selective emulators of EU institutions, where they adopt and adapt certain EU norms, certain EU rules, standards in highly specific policy areas, and implement them within the Israeli domestic system. I would argue that institutional change in Israel that is traceable to the EU, therefore, stems primarily from two types of contagion, diffusion mechanisms. For those of you who are writing applications for the next ISA meeting, the theme of the next ISA meeting in San Francisco is going to be diffusion, right? Surprise, surprise, Tanya Borzel and Ethel Solinger. So this issue of diffusion, how do norms, how do institutions, how do rules diffuse? And my argument is that really there are two mechanisms that drive EU influence on the Israeli domestic system. One is what we might call market competition isomorphism, or in a simpler way, Israeli business essentially putting pressure on the Israeli government to align Israeli rules with that of the single market of the European Union, so that Israeli companies can better compete in the European single market, which is still our largest export market, so on and so forth. Maybe not for long. And the second contagion or emulation mechanism is lesson drawing, where Israeli policymakers essentially look for policy solutions. They don't find a solution within the domestic system. They look outside to the United States. They look to Europe. We tend to be fairly selective about where we look. And they lesson draw. They don't mimic. They don't actually, do a cut and paste, although that has happened as well in the past. But they look to existing legal, regulatory, institutional models within the European Union. They adapt them to the Israeli domestic context, and they implement them. Okay? The final argument I made in the paper, and I'm not going to linger on this too much, is that the influence capacity of the European Union has actually diminished as a result of two things. One, Israel's membership in the OECD. Israel's membership in the OECD fulfills a kind of psychological need that Israel has to belong to a prestigious club, right? The fact that we are members gives us a sense that this is a fairer club for us to belong to, because we are not eligible for full membership in the European Union, but also because the EU itself is just a weakening magnet. It's less of an attractive model to emulate than it was even 5 or 10 years ago. Okay. All right, so that's the argument of the paper. People who are interested in EU-Israel relations, absolutely, please delve into it, and it's on the website, right, Galia, with all the papers. Okay, my dependent variable is institutional change. What do I mean by institutions? I mean social structures and systems of rules or norms. They can be both formal and informal. The latter, i.e. informal systems, defined as expectations of appropriate conduct on a given collective identity. Sort of a classic Powell and DiMaggio definition of institutions, and therefore institutional change would be administrative, regulatory, legal, or policy change that is either merely formal, okay, or extends to include shifts in discourse, expectations of appropriate conduct, or actual policy behavior. All right, those are my definitions. And one of the things I did in the paper, which I hope is of use and interest, is to disaggregate that independent variable. I find that much of the literature, certainly in international law, but also in international relations, tend to bundle up different layers of impact, different layers of external influence on domestic change. And I want to unbundle that, and I want to suggest that we can think about external influence on three layers or three dimensions of impact, and what I call sort of the three I's, okay? One would be insertion, which is formal rule adoption that entails the de jure transposition of EU rules, standards, regulatory models, or norms. Okay, and in a minute you'll see why I think it's important to disaggregate these different dimensions of external impact. The second would be internalization. Internalization occurs when domestic constituencies, typically political, regulatory elites, business elites, become cognizant of EU rules and come to view them as legitimate and desirable sources of rules and practice for themselves, for the domestic system. Okay, so this is formal legislation, taking a rule, putting it on the law books, and saying this is now the rule. This involves a much more psychological shift, a policy and psychological shift, where these elites become cognizant of EU rules, they become familiar with them through epistemic communities and so on and so forth, and they begin to identify them as both legitimate sources of law and as desirable sources of law, right? And we might ask ourselves, we know that norms don't travel freely. We might ask ourselves, why is it that Israel, for example, would not look to Burma or to Guatemala as a source of regulatory and legal norms? Why do we look to the United States? Why do we look to Europe? Why do we occasionally look to Canada, Australia, and so on and so forth? And we can spend a fair amount of time thinking about that. But different countries have different groups of peership, right? Different groups of association, and they see different sources of law and institutions as being desirable and legitimate. I think it's interesting to think what makes us believe that we will find better solutions in Europe or the United States than we can come up with endogenously and so on and so forth. So that's what I mean by internalization. Jeffrey Checkel makes an interesting distinction between what he calls type A and type 2 internalization, or what he calls socialization. What he calls type A or type 1 internalization, you change your discourse, you change your behavior, not because you're convinced that the model that the EU offers is right or superior. You change it because you want to be socially accepted by Europe. You see other countries around you that you associate yourself with doing the same. And so your identity has not changed, but your to use a sort of a game theory concept, your choice set has become constricted. And you are now choosing within a limited set of options that in this case would come from the EU. What Checkel calls type 2 socialization is a much deeper psychological process where and what's interesting about this is that if the external incentive or the external attraction of the EU evaporates, then you're no longer convinced about the efficacy of the EU rule, right? You do it because you identify the EU as being successful, being a model that you want to emulate, but there hasn't been this kind of deep identity change within you that has made you convinced that that institution, that rule is really correct. That happens with type 2 socialization. We're talking about a real identity change, okay, within the decision makers' notion of the appropriateness of the rule or the institution. Okay, so that's my second I: insertion, internalization, implementation. Actual policy shift, because you can if you think about it, you can have a lot of rules on the law books, and you can even have a lot of internalization, but that will not necessarily lead to actual policy change, right? For actual policy change to happen, you also need additional things, including state capacity to implement the change. So this is how I sort of disaggregate the dependent variable. Why is it important? It's important because of what John Myers and others have called shallow influence or fake compliance or institutional decoupling, where you have what I've just described. Countries signing on to international human rights treaties, countries taking on various international obligations. It remains on the level of insertion, right? It remains on the level of being on the law books officially. but it never actually gets implemented. So this issue of institutional hypocrisy or shallow compliance is something that, again, is a theme that comes up when we think about this issue of external influence on domestic change. The other 2 points are not as interesting. I'm gonna move on. I mentioned this issue of capacity. This is something that Abraham and Antonia Chase, in their excellent book on the new sovereignty, put a great emphasis on, right? The need for states to have administrative institutional capacity to be able to actually implement externally driven reform. Okay. So those are my 3 I's, right? This is how I think about institutional change within the domestic system. Well, what are the tools? What are the methods by which international actors, they could be states like the United States, they could be international institutions like the World Bank or the UN or the OECD or the EU or the IMF. What are the methods that we have to seek to transform a targeted state, a targeted national system? I want to suggest, and these are very silly tags, but I spoke about the 3 I's. I want to speak about the five C's. It just helps us to kind of memorize these concepts. Each of these is derived. People who are IR buffs, you will immediately recognize that they're derived from different logics of influence in IR theory, but I'm not gonna linger on that. And of course, I'm drawing out a caricature here. These are ideal types. They never actually exist in pure form. They always interact with one another in the real world. Okay, so the first method of external influence that we have is control. John Owen, in an excellent article in I.O. from 2002, records over 500 instances where international actors have gone into other countries and have basically obliterated the choice of domestic decision makers and imposed the establishment of institutions, right? This has been done through processes of colonialization, military occupation, and what Jim Fearon and David Layton called neo-trusteeship, right? In Bosnia-Herzegovina today, many of the institutions of Bosnia-Herzegovina have basically been imposed by the Dayton peace agreement. But control is not just about coercive power. Control can also be legal control, right? Legal authority, what the Germans call Herrschaft. You have to comply, if you're a member state of the EU, you have to comply with EU law by force of your membership in the European Union. And any domestic law that you have that clashes with the European rule or norm is illegal. So you have compelling legal authority that is really, within certain systems, transforming the domestic governance structures of member states and international organizations. The EU is an extreme example of that. But there are softer examples. Every country that is a member of the OECD takes on certain rules. Even though there's no OECD court to enforce this, there is Herrschaft, right? There is legal control that obliges you to change. The key about control is that the domestic decision maker really doesn't have any choice in the matter. Okay? They're either forced to do it through coercion or they're forced to do it through the power of law. Our second method of influence is what we might call conditionality or manipulation of utility calculations. Right? It's a rationalist, bargaining-based mechanism. Domestic actors retain their autonomy. They retain their autonomous decision making. But at the same time, they are self-interested utility maximizers. They follow a logic of anticipated consequences. They weigh the costs and benefits of compliance with the demand of the external actor, right? The EU says, if you take on the 80,000 pages of the acquis communautaire and you fulfill the Copenhagen criteria, you will have these tremendous incentives of joining the single market, of having a place around the table in the council, in the commission, in the parliament, and so on and so forth. The United States would say, if you do X, we will not impose sanctions on you, right? So sticks and carrots, okay? Manipulation of utility, utility calculations. Now, what's more interesting about this is what are the fact that the influence density, if you like, right? The influence capacity of conditionality can vary very, very greatly depending on a number of parameters. One is the relative bargaining power, right, of the actor that is trying to transform the targeted state and the targeted state itself. Including the availability of viable alternatives, right? So let me give you a very simple example. For the Czech Republic and Hungary and Poland, joining the European Union at the beginning of the 1990s was the only game in town, right? They didn't see themselves having a political or an economic future belonging to a different club. For Turkey, it's a different story. Yes, Turkey would like to join the European Union, but Turkey also sees itself as having alternatives. Having alternatives in the Middle East and elsewhere. So the relative bargaining power of the actors is clearly important. The size and the speed of the rewards is clearly important. The credibility of conditionality. Can I deliver on the promises that I made? The size and distribution of domestic costs of compliance. This is a little bit more of a complicated point, but basically I want to know how powerful are my change agents within the targeted states versus the veto players who can block the change? And the more I have change agents and the weaker the veto players and their ways of empowering change agents and weakening veto players, the more influence I'm going to have using conditionality. Finally, the Terminan Sea of Conditions. What this means is that the more specific a rule is, right? Part of the hugely persuasive power of the acquis communautaire, right, of the rules of the European Union, is that we're talking about 85,000 pages of rules and norms that are extremely specific. And they touch every aspect of human life, from banking standards to food safety to nuclear safety. When you're trying to influence a country by conditionality, asking a country to comply with highly specific rules is much more effective than doing it with very diffuse principles or norms, right? For two reasons. One is the informational dimension, i.e. the country knows exactly what they need to do. Secondly is the compliance monitoring dimension, i.e. it's much easier to slip away out of very vague, diffuse standards than slipping away from extremely precise, determinant rules. I'm running out of time. In fact, I'll probably run out of time. I wanted to speak a little bit about capacity building, about communication or socialization. That also has different, there are different axes on which we can evaluate how persuasive, how powerful a socializing actor would be in the international system. Maybe we can get back to it when we have some time for Q&A. I've really gone out of time. My final point, my final method of influence is going to be contagion, right? Where the influence of the external actor has nothing to do with what the external actor does. It has everything to do with what the external actor represents, right? People want to be like the United States, or at least wanted to be like the United States, because of the city upon the hill idea. People wanted to be like the European Union because of the magnet power of the EU as a community of prosperous democratic states, rather than anything that the EU does. Some people make the arguments, and I'm going to end on that. For example, Beth Simmons, that really the most powerful instrument of transformation of other countries is neither conditionality, no socialization, certainly not control, but it's contagion. It's the diffuse spread of modern norms, institution, laws through very diffuse processes of globalization. I guess I'm going to end on that, and hopefully we can come back to some of these themes at Q&A. Sorry for taking up more time than I should have. Thank you.
Thank you, Amichai. We will now show Professor Janice Stein's presentation, and she's speaking on Inside Out, Israel as the exposed nerve of the international legal order.
Shalom, everyone. I'm so sorry not to be with you in person at the conference, but my broken foot did not work with me on this. I want to wish a warm mazel tov to the Davis Institute for 40 years of excellence in research and an extraordinary contribution to scholarship and to public policy. I wrote my paper for this conference on Israel and international law, and I want to make the argument to you that Israel's conduct in war stands really as the exposed nerve of an international legal order that is fragmenting and breaking apart. Brought to everyone's attention recently by the Goldstone report, Israel's conduct in an asymmetrical war raises all these contradictions of a legal order whose underlying principles of legitimacy are now in question. Unfortunately, the Goldstone report, I argue in the paper, ignored all these complexities and contradictions and really missed the chance to push forward the discussion of international law in a radically changed context. Legal systems play an important role in constituting the structure of the world in which we live and in legitimating state practices. For the past 3.5 centuries, the legal principle of sovereignty both reflected and shaped the international state system. It's particularly true of international legal orders that they lag behind the practices that they codify. They're conservative, they're slow to change, they're deliberative in their style, in large part because there is very little jurisprudence, unlike national legal systems. But the legal orders do change, and new legal norms and principles do get articulated. The last 50 years have been an extraordinary period of creativity in the development of the international legal system, the outlawing of genocide. After the Nazi genocide in 1948, the prohibition of torture, the legal requirements around the treatments of prisoners of war, the adoptions of the Geneva Convention, enormous progress in human rights law, all changes in the last half century. Although some of these principles and the legal obligations that flow from them have not been observed very often in practice, their legality is not contested, and they serve as the legitimating framework for the international system. These principles, I argue in the paper, are beginning slowly to come apart, and let me focus on one in the time we have together, the constitutive principle of sovereignty. An example of the challenge to this core principle, core legal principle, is the doctrine of the responsibility to protect, which was passed by the General Assembly in 2005. And that circumscribes the absolute sovereignty of states when they abuse in a serious way the rights of their own citizens. The invasion of Libya was justified under the responsibility to protect doctrine. I argue in paper that we are seeing a similar challenge to the laws of war, and that this is evident particularly in asymmetrical wars, wars in a way that are unintelligible from the principles of sovereignty as conventionally understood. In an asymmetrical war, at least one of the parties is an irregular force that represents no recognized sovereign state. Its army has no uniform, the war has no front. There is no recognized battlefield. But I think scholars mistake the meaning of asymmetrical war when they focus only on the asymmetries in military power. The critical difference here is not only the imbalance of military power, one weaker, one stronger. There is always one weaker, one stronger, even in conventional war. The defining difference is that of form. One is a state, the other is not. One has an army, the other does not. And the front is everywhere and nowhere. The battlefield is among civilians, in neighborhoods, in streets, in cafes, and in this kind of war, performance is often as important as material power, and the context is about legitimacy. It is this kind of asymmetrical war which Israel has fought for the last 2 decades, on one front or another. It has fought these wars within a legal framework fraught with contradiction and ambiguity, because the legal framework was constructed for a very different kind of world order. A world order characterized by states where wars were fought between armies. That kind of war is now increasingly rare. There are 4 sets of legal principles in play here. The laws of war, which have 2 separate dimensions, jus ad bellum, or the legality of the war itself. Is the war just? Is it a war of last resort? Is there no other alternative? These are the kinds of questions that inform just war theory. The second dimension, jus in bello, or the right in the conduct of war, which have to do with the practices during war. We look here at what combatants do to one another in their official capacity. The third body of law, the laws of human rights, which enshrine the universal right to life with dignity, and finally, international humanitarian law. These 4 bodies of law, as I explore in the paper, are often in contradiction with one another. They are not consistent. The laws of war, for example, which acknowledge that the use of force may be legitimate and right under some circumstances, even when it leads to the death of an enemy soldier, is in complete contradiction with human rights law, which accords every living being the right to life and dignity. There's no avoiding this contradiction. We really cannot finesse it. I want to pay particular attention in this presentation to the first 2 bodies, the justness of war and the practices of war, and look at the Goldstone report and the enormous missed opportunity that this report represents. Justness of war is an extraordinarily difficult question to answer, despite centuries of scholarship. To answer this question, we need to rewind history and imagine roads not taken or alternative paths in history. It's especially hard to do this in the context of asymmetrical war. In the days of state-to-state war, when one army attacked another, on land or at sea, there was little ambiguity about who used force first and the right to self-defense. But what do we think when a militia sends its missiles against a civilian population? Missiles which do no great physical damage, but nevertheless terrorize the population for months on end. Is the use of force a just response against these missiles? Has every other alternative been tried and failed? And is the firing of missiles against a civilian population itself an act of war, a casus belli that legitimates use of force in response? There are few unambiguous answers to these questions. The laws of war in the UN Charter are unequivocal that governments have the right to self-defense when they are attacked. However, again, these laws were developed for state-to-state warfare where attack is clear. And there is no jurisprudence on the right to self-defense in asymmetrical warfare. For example, how big does the attack by a non-state actor have to be? Does it matter whether infrastructure is disabled or people are killed? Did the attack by Al-Qaeda on the World Trade Center cross the threshold and legitimate a use of force in response? Why? What's the number? What's the threshold? Does the attack now justify, 10 years later, attack against Al-Qaeda's leaders who are living in villages, or attacks which simultaneously kill innocent civilians who live next door? Is preemptive assassination of known leaders who have perpetrated attacks in the past and may well do so again in the future a justifiable strategy under the laws of war? Or does there have to be credible evidence that a militant leader is planning an attack? And who decides whether the evidence is credible? Does it have to be a judicial decision, Or can it be an executive decision, or one made by the commander-in-chief? To take a specific example, was President Obama correct when he insisted that anyone who questioned the right of the United States to kill Osama bin Laden had to have had their head examined, as he put it? Who was acting as judge or jury, and what guiding principle was the president using? An explosive debate has now broken out in the United States based on an investigation by the New York Times of the multiple decisions that President Obama has made in the last 2 years to strike leaders through drone attacks that kill not only these militant leaders, but civilians who are with them at the time. And this debate is now raging in part on the justness of the use of force and in part on issues of unconstrained executive power. There are no governing legal principles which satisfactorily settle these questions. Now, it is this context in which the Goldstone report was commissioned, and there was here an opportunity to reopen and reflect on the larger questions of just war in the context of asymmetrical conflict. Justice Richard Goldstone, as you all know, was asked by the Human Rights Council of the United Nations, hardly a neutral body, to head a fact-finding mission on the legality of the war in Gaza and the behavior of both combatants, Hamas and Israel. Justice Goldstone made public his report in September 2009, and I argue very strongly in this paper that he missed the opportunity to think through the relevance of international law to asymmetric conflict and to examine where law had to be supple in application even though its principles held. The report paid far more attention to the first dimension, right conduct in war, jus in bello, than it did to the prior question of the justness of war. Justice Goldstone left unanswered the broad question of whether there are any conditions when non-state actors are justified in attacking the civilian infrastructure of a state. The Commission answered only partly and indirectly by speaking of the potential war crimes and possible crimes against humanity by both Israel and Hamas. That the crimes allegedly committed by Hamas were intentional, Goldstone explained, goes without saying. Its rockets were purposefully and indiscriminately aimed at civilian targets. The intentional striking of civilian is unjust under any circumstance, and therefore, by implication, using legal reasoning would justify use of force in response. The question for Israel and for those who respond to non-state attacks is what constitutes a legal and just response. On this issue, the report is silent. Nevertheless, the report is clear that international law does apply to asymmetric war, again quoting Goldstone. The laws of armed conflict apply no less to non-state actors such as Hamas than they do to national armies. Ensuring that non-state actors respect these principles and are investigated when they fail to do so is one of the most significant challenges facing the laws of armed conflict. Only if all parties are held to the same standards will we be able to protect civilians. This strong judgment suggests that no deliberate attack against civilians can be justified, ever, whether by a state or a non-state actor. Yet, when it comes to the appropriateness of practices in response, the report is again silent. What constitutes a just military response to attacks by non-state actors? Israel had repeatedly warned against the attacks, threatened consequences, and responded with raids, but Hamas was undeterred. Israel's leaders knew full well that any military response, no matter how carefully planned, no matter how surgically designed, would kill innocent civilians because rockets were placed amongst the civilian population. Even with no deliberate intention to kill civilians, even with adequate warnings, there would nevertheless be civilian casualties. The Goldstone report is fatally silent about how this context moderates legal principles, yet it is the context that is at the core of the application of laws to cases. Practices are the core of the missing argument in the Goldstone report, and legal principles designed for practices and contexts so different are not helpful as we grapple with these issues today. There are four sets of principles here: distribution, distinction, proportionality, and necessity. And I look at these principles in detail in the paper. Let me summarize the argument just in a sentence now by saying that these principles too contradict one another, and it is in these contradictions that the anvil of international law will have to be tested if it is to become relevant to asymmetric war, the most frequently occurring kind of conflict that we have in the international system today. Let me add, just by way of epilogue, that the Goldstone report accused both Israel and Hamas of potential war crimes and possibly crimes against humanity. Then came the stunning admission by Justice Goldstone in an op-ed published almost 2 years later, 18 months later, after the original report was released. And I quote, "We know a lot more today about what happened in the Gaza War of 2008-2009 than we did when I chaired the fact-finding mission. If I had known then what I know now, the Goldstone report would have been a different document." End of quote. What did Justice Richard Goldstone learn in the intervening year? Hamas had conducted no investigations of its alleged war crimes, while Israel had launched more than 400 operational investigations. An independent review of these investigations found some misconduct by individual soldiers, but concluded, and here's the defining legal principle, that civilians were not intentionally targeted as a matter of policy. Even though the investigations were conducted by Israel's officials, not by independent third parties, the principal ground on which the Goldstone report had alleged war crimes no longer appeared to be valid. Even when intentionality is no longer at issue, jus in bello, or practices in war, those by the weaker non-state actor, as well as those in response by the state actor, remain challenging. First, Justice Goldstone argued, laws of war do apply. "I continue to believe," he insisted, "in the cause of establishing and applying international law to protracted and deadly conflicts. Simply put, the laws of armed conflict apply no less to non-state actors like Hamas than they do to national armies." Yet the report made no systematic effort to come to grips with the challenge of protecting civilians when neighborhoods and streets are the battlegrounds, when militias use civilians as human shields, when guns are on the roof of residences, and when one side deliberately provokes the other. This was a historic missed opportunity. Why then, in the midst of war, do we continue to struggle with these legal principles and judgment? Why then, in the face of an enemy, do we take any risk with a soldier's life? Michael Walzer provides a convincing answer. We return, he says, to a practice of systematic public reflection. And we do so in part because it is international legal principles which define and accord legitimacy in international life. The purpose of asymmetrical war is often to delegitimize, to force a state to behave in ways that are considered illegitimate or less than fully human. Once we understand asymmetric war as a struggle for legitimacy, it becomes clear why struggling with the ethical imperatives of the laws of war matter, and matters a great deal. This struggle is important not only for instrumental reasons to avoid delegitimation, but also for the values and the identities of a society facing this kind of challenge. It is through this struggle that the content of international law will be redefined and remade for the 21st century, and it is through this struggle that states will be legitimized and delegitimized. Thank you very much, and I look forward to seeing many of you soon.
We're really thankful for having Janice Stein present here despite the fact that she's absent. We are moving now to our third speaker, Professor Robbie Sable. Professor Sable will speak about Israel and the UN resolution.
Abraham, thank you.
20 minutes.
Amichai, I was a bit worried listening to your lecture when you talked about the influence that the OECD has on Israel, and I remembered Groucho Marx's wisecrack, which we all know that he's not willing to join a club that's willing to accept him as a member, so perhaps we should be worried about it. I've taken the subject of Israel and the United Nations, Israel and United Nations resolutions. I don't know how many of you know the city Haifa, but there's a lovely boulevard which goes down from the Merkaz HaKarmel, from the center of the Carmel, down past the Baha'i Gardens, down to the lower city, and it's called the Boulevard of Zionism. I don't know how many Israelis remember its original name. Avram, I'm sure, does. Shdot Ha'um, United Nations Boulevard. There's been a metamorphosis, a sea change in the relationship between Israel and the United Nations organization. And I think there's a background to this, of an IR background and an international law background. Weak movements need to rely on international organizations, on international statements. We only have to recall the background to the Zionist movement, the enthusiasm of the Balfour Declaration, but above all of the 1922 League of Nations mandate, which talked about the right of Israel, right to reconstitute the Jewish national home in Palestine. This was a tremendous breakthrough for the weak Zionist movement. And we did it by multiplying our force, by pretending that we controlled the public opinion, which we didn't. And we managed to get it. The same is true of the 1947 partition plan, with its impossible borders. But the fact that the UN had recommended creation of a Jewish state and an Arab state, all of us, we've seen on the newsreels the dancing in the streets, because the United Nations have recommended. The same was true, by the way, when Israel was accepted. And this I already remember, 1949, when Israel was accepted as a member of the United Nations, we had joined the club. Despite what Groucho Marx is about. Tremendous. I think, and by the way, Victor Katan, who I think perhaps is the pre-eminent Palestinian international lawyer, wrote a book titled From Coexistence to Conquest, International Law and the Origins of the Arab-Israel Conflict, a book which is not very pro-Israel or friendly to the Zionist movement, but he writes, interestingly enough, I'm quoting, "International law was pivotal to the development of the Jewish national home." And, he continues at a different page, ultimately, international law would give the Zionist movement legitimacy. It's written by a Palestinian international thought. And Roger Fisher, whom we all know from Harvard, I think summarizes it correctly when he says, legitimacy and lawful authority are key components of political power. There's been a change here. Now, in our tiny little part of the world, we are the established powerful state. The Palestinians see themselves, whether correctly or not, as the weak movement, needing international resolutions, needing the UN, needing international legitimacy. There's been a change here. Perhaps I, an Israeli, am happy to be in a state and not having to run after international organizations, but we see this. And Palestinians, supporters, have an overwhelming majority in the United Nations, and this is a political weapon they are using, from their point of view, very wisely and correctly. Because they realize that international support, international legitimacy is, as Fisher talked about, a key component. We've seen this in cases where we failed, cases where we succeeded. If I had to look at one failure of Israel, is in the question of settlements. We have legal arguments, and I spent my career in the foreign ministry making them. Frankly, we've lost this international legal battle for legitimacy. There is not a single state that supports Israel's position, though we have very good legal arguments of that this settlement policy is correct. The United States stopped saying it's illegal, they simply say it harms the peace process. That was our big achievement. We've lost it. That doesn't mean that we're wrong and the world is right, but we've lost it. By the way, some things we've won. I don't know whether you recall in the early years, Amichai would know this, that whenever there was an international condemnation of terrorism, it was always added, but you've got to understand the reasons, you've got to understand the motives, and we have to eliminate the sources and so on. Inevitably, any organization says, oh yes, terrorism is bad, but
the root causes.
They've lost that. If you look at recent UN international organizations, the but has been omitted. Deliberate killing of civilians is prohibited, period. And this was a fight that we fought by ourselves in the early years. Obviously, 9/11, that sort of helped us. In the early years, people would say, oh yes, terrorism is bad, but you've got to understand the Palestinians. You don't hear that anymore. So in this sense, sometimes we do win battles, but sometimes we lose them. Using the UN, however, for to achieve political statements is problematic from terms of your international law. It's a very democratic organization, the UN. One state, one vote. It's meaningless, completely meaningless to say that Micronesia, or our great friend Marshall Islands, has the same vote as China or as Russia. It's absolutely meaningless. All of us here could make a calculation that you could get a 2/3 majority of the United Nations, and the minority would consist of Russia, China, the United States, Canada, and the whole of Western Europe. But there will be 2/3. What does that mean? It's completely meaningless. Why do we do it? Because of, you all remember Churchill's wisecrack, there's no alternative. The alternative is worse. There's no way of passing resolutions except by Micronesia, yes, China, no. But it represents nothing. Not the majority of population, not the wealth, not armed forces, nothing, certainly not morality. The drafters of the UN Charter were aware of this, even though at the time the UN obviously was a pro-Western organization. And without being too cynical, Israel liked the UN when there was a Western majority, and we're not unhappy when there's a third world majority. But the big bloc in the early years was the 15 member states of Latin America. They were the powerful bloc. If you recall the 47 partition, we were petitioning, we were running after Guatemala and Honduras. That was the big bloc. It's no longer so. So it's a meaningless majority vote. And as I said, when in San Francisco, when the UN Charter was being drafted, they carefully refrained from giving any power to the United Nations General Assembly resolutions. They are not binding. And the fact that they've been repeated year after year doesn't make it binding. However, Palestinian lawyers are aware of this, so they have a theory. They say, okay, it's not really. We realize the UN Charter doesn't make UN resolutions binding, but when it's repeated year after year, it becomes a sort of a quasi-legislative body. And the answer is, if a resolution is not binding once, repeating it doesn't make it binding. And there's a lovely phrase by Prosper Weil, who's a French international lawyer, but my French pronunciation is so awful, so I'm going to quote it in English. What he wrote was, on this very issue, neither is there any warrant for considering that by dint of repetition, non-normative resolutions can be transmuted into positive law through a sort of incantatory effect. Repeat it, suddenly becomes law. It's not law. And there is no support. No state supports the fact that UN resolutions are binding. There's not a single state on record which says, yes, we accept it. Nevertheless, we have this aura of UN resolutions. And it's caused a warping of international law. Strange versions of international law have arisen from them. Some of them have been referred to here. The fact that there was self-defense, and we got this from the International Court of Justice, only against states. In other words, it arose in the wall in the separation fence, the separation wall, that we had no right to do it because we were not attacked by a state, we were attacked by a non-state body. This now is international law. Or the other thing, armistice lines are permanent boundaries. This applies apparently only to Israel. Now, I'm not saying Israel may want to decide to, for its own reasons, to adopt the 1949 armistice line as boundary. That's a political decision. Each one of us has his own views. But to say that under law an armistice line is a permanent boundary has been applied only to Israel. No armistice line anywhere in the world. By the way, between North and South Korea, there's still an armistice line. Nobody said, well, that's a permanent boundary. Only it's been tailor-made for Israel. Janice Stein referred to the Commission of Inquiry. The Israeli Commissions of Inquiry, that there was no foreigners there. Commissions of Inquiry, independent commissions of inquiry, are respected everywhere in the world, only as regards Israel. So you must have foreign people represented, otherwise it's not legitimate. In other words, Israeli judges, Israeli Supreme Court, they're not valid, only foreigners, applied only. Military occupation sounds bad. And though I've been in Europe, and all of us have been in Europe, when you talk about military occupation, it doesn't sound pleasant. It evokes the Second World War. Nobody likes the idea of it. But is it illegal? Military occupation under the laws of war is legal. Again, I'm not saying it's the pleasantest form of government. The Security Council has been very careful never to call the Israeli occupation illegal. But this has become common currency, all of us. It is the Israeli illegal occupation. Why has it not been? Because all the powers, the states, know that in times of war you do occupy. The United States occupied Iraq after the First Gulf War. After the Second World War, it occupied Japan, it occupied Germany. It's legal. Again, I'm not saying it's a good solution, it's positive. But somehow it's been stamped for Israel illegal. Again, Janice referred to civilian casualties. There's a new rule of law that all civilian casualties means there's been a violation of the laws of war. And the more casualties, the greater the... This is not law. Law looks at the intention, at the mens rea. Was it negligent? Did you intend to? I remember in my course in law, we had a course in Introduction to Psychology. And there was a silly example they gave there of judging the maturity of children. You ask one child, if somebody broke 10 plates by mistake, or 1 plate on purpose, who is the naughtier child? Children of a certain age say, well, 10 plates, obviously he's the naughtier child. As you grow a bit older, you say, well, no. We have the same thing here. You examine what was your intention, did you take steps to prevent it? No, casualties, automatically. If Israel's concerned, it means a violation of the laws of war. The separation fence may not be popular, may not be nice, and it certainly harms Palestinians' access to land, to water, and so on. Apartheid? This is a racial discrimination. But you'll see, all you have to do is Google separation fence, you'll see the apartheid. Completely new definition of apartheid as far as Israel is concerned. Not only has there been a warping of international law, but to a certain extent the Palestinian reliance on international resolutions has made real negotiations more difficult. And I've had this in my experience in Track 2, and I know Avraham has been a frequent participant in Track 2 negotiations with the Palestinians. Why? Because their reliance on what they consider to be international organizational resolutions makes it more difficult to negotiate a pragmatic solution. I think a classic example is Resolution 194, which talks about the right of those refugees wishing to return and live in their homes should be allowed to do so at the earliest practical moment, which has somehow been extended to the descendants. This is also a new form of international law. I know of no other situation where they say, oh yes, children, grandchildren, forever and ever, they all have right which their forefathers had. But leaving that aside, when we try to negotiate a practical answer, the Palestinians I've talked to have always said, we are perfectly aware 5 million Palestinians are not going to return to Israel. We don't expect you to do that. Clearly, only a minority will want. But you must accept the principle that they have a right to do so. And we're wary, I think, of accepting the principle. All of us will recall Bernard Shaw's wisecrack when he approached the lady and said, excuse me, would you be willing to spend the night with me for £1 million sterling in cash? She said, well, that's a pretty interesting and attractive proposal. He then went on and said, and what about doing it for £10? And she said, what do you think, I'm a prostitute? And he said, that we've already decided, we're talking about the price now. I'm not sure that we can accept the principle, which is not international law. And this has made those pragmatic Palestinians who want to save it are stuck with this. No, you must recognize this issue of 194, which we're not. It's not law, and it makes real negotiating more difficult. Inalienable rights, Palestinians. If it's inalienable, you can't negotiate it. The answer is they have rights, and you do negotiate it. But the moment it's inalienable, it's a problem. Sovereignty. The moment they insist on sovereignty and say, well, let's look at elements, therefore we've got to have the rights of aircraft and flying and so on, which a sovereign state can negotiate about. But if it's an absolute issue, we have a problem. The role of the United Nations, and here there's an interesting, is the United Nations, does it have a legitimate role? Here the International Court of Justice on the separation fence made an interesting statement, which I'd like to quote. The responsibility of the UN in this matter, that is the separation fence, has its origin in the mandate and the partition resolution concerning Palestine. This responsibility has been described by the General Assembly as a permanent responsibility towards the question of Palestine until the question is resolved in all its aspects in a satisfactory manner in accordance with international legitimacy. This responsibility has been manifested by the adoption of many Security Council and General Assembly resolutions. I think, frankly, this is pernicious. The UN, as it is constituted now, was, I think, defined beautifully by Patrick Moynihan, a colorful US senator who was the US ambassador to the UN at the time. I knew him. Herzog was our ambassador at the time. He wrote a book on his period in the UN, and he called the book That Dangerous Place. Frankly, it is now, and it's sad, it is a dangerous place as far as Israel is concerned. Every year it passes about 19 resolutions on one particular country, on Israel. Usually none on any other specific country. There's a permanent, those of you who visited UN headquarters in New York or in Geneva, there's a permanent exhibition on Israeli crimes against Palestinians. 3 special UN bodies deal only with Israel and Palestine. One is the Special Committee to investigate Israeli practices affecting the human rights of the Palestinian people. The other is the Committee on the Exercise of the Inalienable Rights of the Palestinians. And there's a special division for Palestinian rights which has, last year it had 16 permanent staff and a budget of millions of dollars. Only on Israel do these organizations. No other country, not Sudan, not Libya, Syria, has the honor of having permanent UN bodies funded by the UN dealing only with it. We have a problem there. Janice Stein referred to the Human Rights Council, perhaps the most pernicious of UN bodies. And I looked at the constitution of the, I've got 3 minutes left. I looked at the constitution, the membership. There's a criterion for membership, which goes, and I'm quoting, it takes into account the candidate state's contribution to the promotion and protection of human rights. Contribution to the promotion and protection of human rights. Well, let's look at the list of states, some of the states that clearly fulfill this requirement. China its contribution to human rights has been immense. Saudi Arabia, it's one of the main contributors, I would say, to human rights in the world. Jordan, now I like Jordan. It's a friendly state. It's a stable state. It's friendly to Israel. To say that it's contributed a lot to human rights, question mark. Russia certainly contributed to world culture, to world literature, to world music. To say that it's contributed to human rights, I would add things. Kuwait, tremendous contribution. Libya, these are members of the Human Rights Council. And Cuba, these are states that really contributed. We have a problem there. From 2006 to 2010, there were 33 resolutions concerning particular states. 27 of them were Israel. 33, 27 of them were Israel. But they've dealt with Syria. And I don't know whether you looked up the website of the Human Rights Council, but 3 days ago, they finally passed a resolution on what's happening in Syria. And you know who's condemned? Nobody. They condemned the acts carried out in Syria, not a word about the Syrian government. We have a real problem with that. My personal experience with one of the UN bodies was with the Committee Against Racial Discrimination. Can I have another minute of them? Yeah. Where we were condemned for everything, and one of the things we were condemned for was that you are a racist state. Why? And I was on behalf of Israel. Look at your flag. It has a Jewish emblem on it. How can you expect your non-Jewish population to respect your state when you have when it's clearly a racist state? You have a religious symbol, the Magen David, on your flag. This meeting took place in Geneva, and I was hesitating. Should I say something? Should I look at the Swiss flag? Should I mention perhaps Sweden, Norway, Finland, Denmark, or the United Kingdom, which, as far as I remember, has 3 crosses on its things? I decided to be politic and shut up. The United Nations, regretfully, sadly, has been kidnapped, and I wouldn't hold our breath to wait and see whether Shderot HaTzionut, the boulevard of Zionism in Haifa, is going to be rechanged and renamed, or named again, the boulevard of the UN. And it's a shame. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Robbie. The 3 presentations that we listened to this morning combine very well with what we heard in the first session from Ellen Doughty about the discussion among the early settlers of what should be the orientation locally or internationally. And it definitely connects with the question of Amichai, why Israel is more willing to learn or to adopt norms from the EU rather than from Burma. I want to ask a very few questions and maybe make one remark. We heard from Amichai primarily about methods and paths of influence by the EU on Israel, but I am not sure that we have good examples of such influence beyond maybe the economic and trade community in Israel. And I wonder how this influence is reflected at the level of the political echelon or the political system. And second question to Amichai is, after we heard about the possibilities or paths or methods of influence, what are the limitations of the EU with regard to other countries, especially in the Mediterranean? We know about the Barcelona and then the Lisbon programs. The influence on many of the Mediterranean countries has been minute, if at all existed or exists. How is it reflected in terms of possibilities or opportunities and constraints? And finally, I would like to make a comment about what we heard both from Janice and from Robbie about the gap between perceptions and reality in the context of international law and norms. In other words, of course, there is a well-known gap between the UN Charter and the humanitarian law. But in the case of Israel, how does it help Israel to use the international law and international arguments when the perceptions of Israel's daily policies are so negative, especially in the post-Oslo years, namely after the beginning of the second Intifada. And the question is whether, speaking in that language of how much the Arab neighboring countries are not contributive to international law and norms, helps Israel overcome the growing perception of Israel, not only illegitimate policies, but illegitimacy as a state. And I think in that sense, what we meant by introducing this session was to really deal with not only the legal language and dry law, but also with the problem of growing erosion of Israel's international legitimacy. And with this, I would like to open the floor for, we have about 15 minutes, and we'll start from this side. Stefan, please.
Yes, thank you very much. I think it was a very interesting panel. Janice Stein's presentation, I think it was very good that we had it. I think it was a very sophisticated and strong argument she put forward, and that's something I would like to add there, which is related to legitimacy. I think it would be extremely helpful and in this whole process of relations. And I come back to that. And I think it's a key point. I often say that when I meet Arab colleagues as well. One of the problems, of course, of legitimacy is that it's very difficult for a state like Israel to enter negotiations, also on the societal level, if there are little signals coming from Arab countries. And this certainly is one of the problems of the Arab Spring and its aftermath. It also relates to the Palestinian side. So it would be helpful advancing on international humanitarian law if there would be more cooperation and talk between and acceptance also from the Arab side beyond the Arab Peace Initiative. So there are signals, but I think it's not enough. International humanitarian law, I think it also assists Israel. The rise of human rights, I said that yesterday, is embodied, for example, in the roadmap. The roadmap specifies that terror attacks against civilians, and it relates to terrorist attacks by Palestinians in the second Intifada in particular and before. This is signaled out as the thing the Palestinians have to deliver. And on the other side, what the Israelis have to deliver is to stop settlement, because it equally infringes upon human rights of Palestinians. In that sense, I think Robbie, I think it's the occupation. I think the problem is not that the illegality in so much stemming from the fact that it's a long occupation, but it's linked to the settlement issue and how this infringes, together with infrastructure issues, the wall, etc., on rights of Palestinians. So it relates to both parties. And I think the interesting thing we see is that increasingly this conflict, but not only this conflict, is embedded in this, like Amichai's presentation, in this governance standards, global standards of what to do and not to do in a conflict. And just saying that I would disagree with the assessment we had in the last presentation that Israel is singled out. There are examples of that, and you refer to that. I think we can see that. But I think if it's presented like that, it could appear as a caricature of how international humanitarian law developed. This hasn't been developed to single out Israel. It applies in so many cases. We have heard that in the presentation. Humanitarian international law, the responsibility to protect. This is a very powerful international norm which is applied to so many conflicts and contexts. And sometimes it's difficult in the case of Syria, but it is a norm which is there and which binds other states to a large degree and singles them out. Also Syria, independently of whether an intervention there takes place or not. But the crimes committed, this has taken on completely new shapes. So I wouldn't be so skeptical or relating it so strongly to occasional instances in which Israel is singled out. This happens, but there's of course also reason to remind Israel for its obligations under international humanitarian law. And there we have to say that I refer to the issue of settlements. Israel is not complying to such instances, but also, as we have heard in the presentation, often the Palestinians aren't. And this is why all these reports come up. And the final sentence, sorry if I took a bit longer, is this was an excellent presentation from Janice. She should have mentioned the Palmer report, I think, as well, because the Palmer report talked a bit more about the just war issue, if I remember it correctly. I haven't looked at it now, but the Palmer report following the Mavi Marmara flotilla issue was more explicit about that one and focused more on that. And this might have been a consequence of an reassessment of the Goldstone report. Sorry that I spoke a bit longer.
Yeah. Please try to be brief and short.
It's been said that if the UN was a bank, not only would it be morally bankrupt, it would be financially bankrupt. Now, it's been said also that Israel has a very good product, but lousy packaging. Very few people know, I mean, the massive majority of people in the world do not know that Israel, per capita, per effectiveness, is really a world leader in giving humanitarian aid, health aid, medical aid to two-thirds of the underdeveloped or emerging countries in the world through Israel aid, through Mashav. It's amazing that we don't get this message across. And maybe we should point out to these countries that receive so much effective aid, if you want it to continue, at least support us or point out in world bodies what you've received from Israel. Thank you.
Question to Professor Magen. At the beginning of the Israeli state, the Constitutive Assembly, if I'm correct, passed what they called in Hebrew the Pkudat Sidrei Shulton Mishpat, the civil administration and law ordinance. And I believe one of the principles that was recognized that there are many lacunae in the Israeli law, or what was the law at that particular time. And one of the principles in this ordinance was that Israeli courts, or the Israeli legal system, would adopt what they said the principles of common law and equity, but there was a sifting.
Hello.
A sifting, some sort of, okay, we have it. There was a sifting system in accordance with T'na'ei ha'aretz u'toshaveha, the conditions of the land and of its residents. And from your talk, I would think that really what's happening is that actually really if we apply foreign law or foreign rules standards, it really is something that is applicable not to the total population or the conditions of the country, but to the conditions of the elites and their requirements. And I wonder if you could perhaps clarify this. In other words, there's been a change in the system by which we apply foreign rules and standards. And one short question to Professor Sable, I would like to know what is the bottom line of your talk, and if possible, could you comment on the September deliberations of the United Nations and the failure of the Palestinians to receive membership as a state in the United Nations.
Thank you. Wow. Okay. We have a long list. Please be short, okay? Please, Ron.
So a quick question for Amichai. It's a quick question, but it'll be a complicated answer, which is that you nicely distinguished three levels, right? Insertion and internalization and implementation. And the only part of your talk that I found sort of at this level so far surprising was not that the implicit in your talk was that the levels were nested, but you also suggested, if I understood you correctly, that implementation follows not only insertion, but it often follows internalization. That was at least the way it was presented. And it seems to me quite common, of course, the literature I think would usually suggest often the other way around. That we often have implementation before we have internalization. Certainly that's the case with regard to human rights norms. And we say things like those who talk the talk eventually walk the walk, and those who talk the talk and walk the walk must, perhaps via the logic of cognitive dissonance, eventually come to believe those things and internalize them. And that's of course problematic because it's a deeply teleological view of these processes. And so, Amichai, I wanted to invite you to reflect a little bit about the origins and consequences of these patterns. What difference does it make if, as you suggested, internalization often precedes implementation? Or what difference does it make if implementation precedes internalization? And finally, and I think really where there's most opportunity for real advance from an IR theory perspective, is what intervenes in these stages and might conceivably reverse them? Because that we haven't thought a lot about.
Yes. No. Okay.
Good question also for Dr. Magen. In the beginning of the presentation, you presented your argument that the EU has limited aspect on the Israel. And at the end of the presentation, you talked about that the main way of influence is not what the EU does, but what it is. I think that could be one of the reasons why it doesn't have an impact. Because I think the things that do have impact is the things that the organizations do and how they adapt themselves to the modern cases, to what Professor Stein talked about of the modern way of war, that it's not, the rules of war doesn't apply to it anymore. So I think it's it could be thought of that the conception that what the EU is its way to influence, it's the reason why it doesn't influence.
Thank you. Oded?
So I also have a question to Amichai. One of the mechanisms that you mentioned was conditionality as a means to impact. Now, conditionality, as far as I understand, applies primarily to the EU accession zone, right? I mean, it wasn't quite clear to me what kind of conditionality applies to countries outside the accession zone. And a second part, a second element, what happens after the rewards for meeting the conditions are given? So we see in cases like Estonia, for example, or Latvia, or many other Eastern European countries, that once they were exceeded based on meeting certain protections for minorities, then situations for minorities deteriorated again, simply because the reward was already granted. So how do we, I guess, monitor or know what happens in the aftermath?
Yael?
Yeah, just real quick, although it might not take you that quick to answer it either, would be if you could maybe use your framework and apply it to some of the things that Janice Stein was saying about means of war in terms of what kind of influence and extensive influence there's there in terms of Israel, in terms of kind of wider international, interpretations of international as vague as they are. And then, I'll keep it at that since you guys have so many questions. My question for you kind of fed off of your question in terms of developing the distinction between legitimacy legitimacy in international law. And it seems like, from what you are saying, there's so many disjunctions at several times that maybe the emphasis shouldn't necessarily be on focusing on adaptations of international law, but maybe lie elsewhere. But it kind of fed off your question.
Thank you. Kumar?
Thanks. This is for Professor Sable. I have a small clarification on 194. If I understand the wording correctly, it says, right to return if you're willing to live in peace with the neighbors. Will that caveat make a difference in the final analysis? That means if I'm going to come back to my ancestors' home with the intention of destroying Israel being a Jewish state, if that's my motive, will I be disqualified? Because that's a very huge caveat, because normally you don't find people talking about that live in peace with the neighbors. It's not an unconditional right to return. It's a conditional return willing to live in peace. Thanks.
Among other conditions
Yeah.
in the resolution. Okay, thank you very much. We will stop here. I'm sorry. There are 3 minutes to each of you, and we will anyway push the lunch break, the coffee break. So please, let's start with Amichai. And
great, thank you for these questions. This is one of the things that happens when you only get through 1/3 of your slides. You leave out a lot of important issues, and many of you have touched on those. So I'm grateful for the opportunity to correct this. Let me begin with internalization, implementation, insertion. You're absolutely right. We can think of situations where you have implementation with, well, you certainly can have insertion without internalization. You can have insertion without implementation, right? What I found in the EU-Israel context was interesting in the sense that I found much greater internalization. I found it greater and prior to formal rule adoption, i.e. to formal insertion. So unlike what we've seen happening in places like Romania and some of the less, shall we say, sophisticated candidate countries, where a tremendous amount of the acquis communautaire was taken onto the law books, and then there was this institutional decoupling, or at least for a prolonged period of time, a big gap between formal rule adoption and actual implementation, is because Israelis tend to be extremely careful, and this goes to Professor Seller's question about the political and the economic, very careful about the EU rules and standards that they actually formally adopt. There tends to be a prior, much wider conversation about policy options happening, and then very selective, so much greater internalization, the development of epistemic communities, discourse in Israel, and then much more selective formal rule adoption. The question was raised about, well, Avram raised this question. I think when we cut away the rhetoric, I think the strategy, the mainstream strategy of Israel vis-a-vis the EU has been as much market access as I can possibly get with as little political interference as I can possibly get away with. And so when we look at instances of actual Israeli formal EU rule adoption, they tend to be in the economic arena. Many times they're business driven. The Israeli pharmaceutical industry, this is another area I didn't manage to get into, the Israeli pharmaceutical industry wants to have its laboratory standards accepted by the EU. It then lobbies and asks for recognition on the part of the EU that Israeli standards are on par with those of the EU. It's much more bottom up than top down. Conditionality. So in the case of what happens once that tool is gone, okay, so first of all, there are international institutions that don't really build their strategy on conditionality. Take the OSCE, for example, right? Very low threshold for access, and then you hope that countries are socialized through interaction, through institutional interactions, into the norms of the institution. The EU membership has been different in the sense that it's what we call ex post conditionality. First of all, you fulfill or you take on the Copenhagen criteria, then you get into the club. As you'll notice, certainly with Romania and Bulgaria, you have mechanisms for monitoring post-accession. because the EU has learned, mainly from the Greek experience, that you need to have these mechanisms for monitoring post-accession. But the hope is that once a country is actually a full member of the club, the density of interaction in the Parliament and the Commission and the Council and so is so great, and the political pressure to comply under normal rules of membership is so great that over time, at least, countries sort of catch up in their levels of compliance and they become another state. Uli Sedelmeier wrote a piece exactly on this, and I'm happy to refer you. Can I say one sentence about legitimacy, because I'm very tempted. Look, the place. First of all, legitimacy is a social concept, right? It's one is either legitimate or illegitimate, not by virtue of standard rules, but by virtue of what the community of nations, what my group of associations think of me, right? So let's first of all remember that legitimacy is a social concept, and if we accept the idea that Israel is the Jew among nations, we can also see that in the international system we may not be very popular. Again, not necessarily for what we do, but for who we are. It seems to me that when we look at the history of warfare against Israel, we can think of this war of delegitimation of Israel as really being the fourth generation of war against Israel. It's a reversal of Clausewitz's idea that war is the continuation of politics through other means. Delegitimation is the continuation of war through other means, right? So the first generation warfare against Israel was conventional war. Arab militaries fighting the state of Israel. The second phase of war was economic. The people tend to forget this, but the boycott campaign, the blacklisting and the boycott campaign against Israel in the 1950s, 60s, and 70s. The third generation of warfare was asymmetrical, terrorist warfare. And when the second Intifada really fizzled out because it was a huge disaster for the Palestinians, we saw a real up in the ante of the campaign that Robbie Sable was talking about, the use of international norms, international institutions as political weapons for seeking to gain strategic gains vis-a-vis Israel. So this is not something that has come out of the blue. In a way, it has always been there, but the war of delegitimation of Israel is really the result of the failure of alternative strategies to try to undermine the state. Thank you.
Thank you. I'll try and answer it in a telegraphic form without any particular order. The right to protect, yes, but it doesn't include the right to use force. The right to use force to protect is only if the Security Council authorizes it, which brings us back to the veto power of the major powers. So without being too cynical, there'll be no use of force to protect if Russia and any other powers object. On the Human Rights Council, Janice said that they authorized the examination of crimes of Hamas and of Israel. Frankly, they didn't. They referred only to Israel. Goldstone, to his credit, I don't know how much credit he has, extended the mandate. He said, I'm going to look at Hamas as well. But the actual mandate he got from the Council referred only to Israel. Palestinians at the UN, my assumption is if they apply to the General Assembly, they will be recognized as a state. They won't make them members of the United Nations because that requires approval by the UN Security Council. But if they do request it, they will be accepted as an observer state, which will mean international recognition of them as a state. I don't think there's very much Israel can do about that. On the right of return, you're absolutely right. It refers to people wishing to live in peace. By the way, there's no reference, of course, to a right of return, nor is there reference to descendants, but it does include the reference to those willing to live in peace. We certainly got a public negative image as a result of the fighting in Gaza. But what is interesting, we didn't get this negative image from the people who actually deal with military affairs in different states. And I had some experience, and my colleagues had more experience, with the judge advocate generals of Western European states and Eastern European states, and they said, you, Israel, took more effort to prevent civilian casualties than we have ever done. But they didn't help us publicly. Publicly, we lost it. On the fence, it certainly harmed Palestinians, their right to water, to the right. The question is, was this proportionate to the prevention of suicide attacks? That is what the Israeli Supreme Court examined. In some cases they found it was. Some cases, there's something the international court refused to look at all. They said, you harmed, which they could clearly, if you have a fence, it harms people. You had a fence, it harms the people. They didn't even look at the question of, was this a proportionate act of self-defense? On the settlement issues, and this is a political statement, the moment we have a border, that will solve the settlement issue. Clearly, a settlement, Jewish settlement living in the Palestinian side will be living there in a Palestinian state. It's up to them whether they want to do it. So the key issue is, where will the border be? Once that's settled, settlements on the Israeli side will be in Israel, the other side won't be, and they've got to accept that. So it comes back to are the Palestinians willing to do the difficult task of actually negotiating a border with us? Once they do, the settlement issue will no longer be the issue that it exists at the moment. And on legitimacy, I'm normally very reluctant to bring in issues of anti-Semitism. I don't think it should be evolved. It should be raised in Israel's foreign policy. There can be legitimate criticisms of Israeli foreign policy. On the one issue of those, and it's a minority, who question the legitimacy of a Jewish national movement, a Jewish state, I think there is a tinge of anti-Semitism. Thank you.
Thank you very much to Amichai and Robbie.